Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books, and I'm very glad to be joined today by an author who is new to Orbis, Kelley Nikondeha, who is the author of this fascinating book, Jubilee Economics: The Purpose, Practices, and Possibilities for a Better Future. Kelley Nikondeha is a liberation theologian, a writer, and a community development practitioner. Her books include Defiant: What the Women of Exodus Teach Us About Freedom, and The First Advent in Palestine: Reversals, Resistance, and the Ongoing Complexity of Hope. She's the director and chief storyteller of Communities of Hope, a community development enterprise in Burundi, where she has worked for the past 15 years with her husband, Claude, with a number of projects, including a bank, a radio station, a porridge factory, a reforestation project, other economic programs. And what underlies them all of these initiatives is the principle of Jubilee, which is a phrase or a term that's familiar from Scripture, referring to a regular 50-year schedule of debt cancellation, land return, and freedom from debt slavery. Jesus invokes this idea even in his first sermon in Nazareth. It's often regarded as a utopian and impractical concept, which, despite the scriptural mandate, was not actually practiced in ancient Israel, but Kelley Nikondeha challenges this belief. She and Claude have tried to envision and implement an approach to economics and development that takes the concept of Jubilee seriously and practically. In their projects in Burundi, through trial and error, they've come to see that Jubilee is about more than debt relief. It represents an ethos, you might even say a spirituality, that could inform a completely fresh approach to economics and social development. So welcome, Kelley. I hope we'll get a chance to hear about what led you to Burundi, but I wonder if you could just start at the beginning by talking to us about the idea of Jubilee, where that comes from, and how you've tried to implement that in your life and your work in Burundi.
Well, thank you for having me today. You actually gave a really great summary just right up top. So you did a lot of the heavy lifting for me already. But Jubilee I first encountered Jubilee as a biblical practice that we hear about in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We have those operatic notes that we hear from Isaiah as he uses this idea to talk about the new city that he imagines post-exile. And then, as you said, Jesus pulls this into the Gospels with his first inaugural address, according to Luke. But Jubilee at its core is a set of economic practices. It's about resetting the economy. And it was actually not so new. That's part of what I think I've learned as a theologian is as I have studied and realized, oh, this isn't just something that came to be in ancient Israel and is first talked about in our biblical text, but actually this was something that the neighbors of Israel and people all the way back to Sumer were practicing, which was debt amnesty. But in the hands of Israel, they did innovate. They did take this idea of large-scale debt relief for the sake of calibrating the economy, and they did innovate. And I think one of the most fascinating things they did was they said, well, it used to be that when a new ruler came into power, within the first 2 or 3 years, there would be a large-scale debt amnesty. That makes the king look good. Everybody feels good when their debts get forgiven. And the economy gets a fresh start. But these leaders could use debt relief and did, some of them multiple times, to reset economies when they got calcified or hung up in some way. But what Israel seemed to realize, or we would say Moses, but this is the tradition, is that it depended on who your leader was, how benevolent, how insightful, how in tune with what was happening, as to whether or not they maybe would use this tool of debt amnesty and setting people free from debt slavery and, even negotiating land return. You needed to have good leaders to know when to do that. And you couldn't always rely on, I think about the leaders we've had over the last set of years in my own lifetime. We've had Jimmy Carter, we've had George W. Bush, we've had Barack Obama, we have our current person in the White House, very different people who would have made very different decisions when right? If these were the kind of personalities deciding, when does society need a fresh start? When does the economy need, and some would have been moved by empathy, others would have been moved by their understanding of the economy, others would have refused to move based on their own personality and pathologies. And so the fact that, Israel came in and said, no, we're going to connect this to the calendar. There is going to be a cycle. Every 50 years, you're going to hear that shofar blow. Doesn't matter who is in control, what judge is in control, who the high priest is, doesn't matter. There will be a reset. And I mean, to me, that was really interesting to see the recognition, for all the conversations about how Jubilee is this very utopian idea. I actually find that ancient Israel had a very clear-eyed sense of the economy, that it mattered who got to proclaim debt release and who didn't, and the character of leaders, that they recognize that the economy gets hung up quite often, either due to natural disasters like famines or loss of, the breadwinner of a family dying and causing harm to the particular family. Like there's all these different reasons economies can get hung up. And so the recognition that, we need to have a safety valve. We need to recognize that every 50 years or so, there needs to be a way to recalibrate. And so to me, Jubilee is actually a really practical, clear-eyed recognition that economies need help, and we need to have a set of tools to do that. And while we would say that the Bible itself doesn't, people always say, well, where are the receipts? We don't see that they practiced Jubilee. But actually, they were making a theological case and giving us a theological narrative in the Bible. But they didn't need to give us receipts because all of their neighbors, we now have so many wonderful artifacts that show us that debt release was actually part of what was happening in the region. So they didn't need to make the case. Nobody would have doubted it. But now we actually have more of those receipts to be able to say, oh, this was practiced. So
you say at some point, that Jubilee or debt relief is good news for those whose debts are being relieved, maybe bad news for those who are not being repaid or whatever. And it raises that just general question about who the economy is for, whether it's for everybody or it's for just those at the top, because we see, in our own country, how easy it is to bail out corporations and banks and things like that. But when there's talk about debt relief, let's say for students, or some people say, oh my gosh, no, that's unfair. Why should they get those benefits and that sort of thing?
Right.
So it comes right here. Talk a little bit about now how you and Claude have implemented this kind of program in a very practical ways in Burundi.
Right. So first of all, I always have said Jubilee is good news for the poor, but hard news.
Hard news, not bad news.
For the well-off. Hard because it puts some hard choices in front of us.
Yeah, right.
And that is a different conversation, I suppose. But Claude and I read this. I think for us, it really started when we read the Gospel of Luke and the way that Jesus talks about Jubilee amongst his impoverished neighbors and says, this is going to begin today. And my husband just grabbed on to the word today. He's like, this means that there is something that is contemporary, that is something we should be doing now. And that really was a really important insight for him as we started doing development work in Burundi. And so a lot of times people wonder, what is development work? And it ranges from advocating for human rights and making sure that the people we work with have their ID and, are officially recognized by their government. It includes agriculture and housing and food security, and right. It's all of these
Mhm.
very practical things that make for a viable kind of life.
Mhm.
And so he's like, well, this Jubilee is something that should be happening today.
Mhm.
So we need to be embodying and practicing these tenets of Jubilee today in Burundi and weave it into the fabric of how we do our work we work in particular with the Batwa people, which is the most marginalized tribe in Burundi. And so yeah, that is kind of where he got excited. Of
Mhm.
course, that sent me as the theologian into the text to make sure we knew deeply what the text was saying, to
Mhm.
then wrestle with the embodiment of it and
Mhm.
how to live it out. And I mean, one of the things that came out for us was we ended up starting a bank.
Yes.
So 97% of Burundians are unbanked. This is one of
Mhm.
the most underdeveloped small countries in East Africa. And his dad never had a bank account. This was just not, you couldn't afford to open it, to maintain it, the fees that were associated. So instead, his mom would keep any cash they had. Crumpled up in a little empty coffee tin, and it would be hidden in the back of her closet, or maybe sometimes she would dig and hide it in their garden, because you didn't have enough money to put it in the
Mhm.
bank. And so we started a bank for the working poor.
Mhm.
We basically took over a microfinance program that was flailing from one of the big, international development operations. We took it over and parlayed that into kind of my husband kind of combined a little bit of microfinance and community banking that he
Mhm.
had learned about here in the States, created a bit of a hybrid. And his idea was to get people, how do we get people into the economy? And I
Mhm.
think that was a lesson we learned pretty early on was, oh, Jubilee, these practices also have a lot to say about nobody should be permanently locked out
Mhm.
of the economy, right? That's
Mhm.
why we always get a reset and get a chance to get back in. And reentry is important. Getting people
Mhm.
into the economy matters. So we wanted to support folks who had the ability, but just didn't have enough capital to create better jobs for themselves and employ their neighbors, et cetera. And so
Mhm.
we started a bank. Um, and I would say about 6 months into that very new
Yeah.
institution, there was a huge fire on a Sunday morning in the central market. Now, the central market is like the pulsating heart of the Burundian economy. Everything goes out, from that space, not just through the capital city, but all the way up into the little markets up country. So when that marketplace burnt to the ground within 5 or 6 hours on a Sunday morning, I mean, it was devastating for the country, but also devastating for us because
Yeah.
70% of the people we were partnered with and had become members of our little
Mhm.
bank, 70% of them operated kiosks in that
Mhm.
bread. And so
Mhm.
I remember thinking, well, this is what Jubilee means. We have to zero out all of their loans. That's what the Bible says.
Mhm. Mhm.
And my husband pushed back and said, if we zero out all those loans, we will lose our certificate with the central bank. There are regulations, there are things that we are not allowed to do
Mhm.
as an official bank. And I think for us, that was the first time where we really had to struggle with, oh, what is in the text
Mhm.
and what is in the Burundian context, and to really grapple with the fact that these are very different economies, um,
Mhm.
and there have to be ways that the Jubilee texts still have wisdom to offer
Mhm.
without forcing us to let go of our certificate of
Mhm.
operation and have no way to support,
Mhm.
these families. And so I think that was where we were like, wow, we really have to both push in pretty hard. Does Jubilee really mean something in this day and age? And I went deeper into the text and started, okay, what are the bigger things?
Mhm.
You know, are there other ways that we can, again, allow people to get back into the economy after something
Mhm.
as terrible as this marketplace fire? Um, are there ways that we can still come alongside the most at risk women, who nobody wanted to, nobody could help them. So how do we create some innovative strategies to create collateral for them and allow them back in? And it really did expand our understanding of the biblical
Mhm.
text. Um, but it was, over the next set of years, a lot
Mhm.
of push and pull between, well, if the Bible says this, like that we're supposed to pay people on time, that we're supposed to not charge it, like the things that you really work hard to embody, but adapt to a modern economic world. I think we have learned
Mhm.
much more about Jubilee and the text.
Mhm.
We've also hopefully changed a lot of how the economy functions for the people that bank with us in Burundi. We now have
Mhm.
13 branches and over 80,000 people that bank with us. Our bank
Mhm.
is over 10 years old now, and we have people who
Mhm.
used to just get $100 loan, and now they're getting 15 and $20,000 loans, and
Mhm.
they are employing lots of their neighbors and have
Mhm.
multiple businesses, and that's exciting to see because these are people who
Mhm.
nobody
Yeah.
nobody was giving them more than $100 for a little stand, in a little market, and now they really are driving the economy.
Well, I thought that was really fascinating the way you moved from a, you might say, a kind of um, fundamentalist reading of the text. This is what Jubilee means, this is what it says in the Bible and everything. And there are situations, let's say the Jubilee 2000 campaign to try to get,
Hmm.
countries to relieve the debt of
Yep.
impoverished, developing countries that have no way of repaying these debts and that sort of thing. But what you kind of did was you stepped back and said, well, what's this really all about? What is
Hmm.
this, what is it's not just about debt relief. It's about kind of promoting inclusion and the economy and flourishing for those at the margins and
Correct.
making people stakeholders, in the economy who otherwise would be left out. And so, and you sort of kind of talk about jubilary principles rather
Hmm.
than just this sort of charter that says, here's what you do every 50 years or something like that.
Right,
And
right.
you began to apply that in all different kinds of ways. I thought that was just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. And I was just this a couple days ago, I noticed that we have some new leadership in New York City,
Hmm.
and the new mayor created a new position. It is called the Deputy Mayor of Economic Justice.
Hmm.
And he
Hmm.
appointed a woman named Julie Sue, who
Hmm.
used to work in the labor department. But I just couldn't believe here he was talking about the importance of um, economic justice and
Hmm.
taking seriously the economic inequity in New York City, and how
Hmm.
that is a key driver, of some of the most negative things happening in the city that have to be honestly addressed. And he created a position, gave Miss Sue a pretty wide remit, he says, for her to actually then support workers and deal
Hmm.
with wages and collective bargaining, all. And it was like they read a chapter out of this book that talked about labor practices
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
with that jubilary sensibility. And I thought, wow, they're going to give it a try. They're going to take seriously the fact that
Hmm.
economic inequity actually is a big thing to whether or not a city will function well
Hmm.
and families will be able to live well because of the connection between economies and families, whether it's in the ancient economy or, in New York in 2026. So
Hmm.
I'm excited to see what does it look like when they try to basically lean into some of these jubilary ideas,
Hmm. Hmm.
take them to scale in New York. We've been
Yeah.
trying in Burundi, and it's exciting to see people trying here.
A lot of time, a lot of it has to do with what your priorities are, and whose interests are our
Mm,
priority. And
true.
we are always talking in this country too about kind of austerity and fiscal responsibility, and we don't have enough money for this or that. And then it turns out there's all kinds of money for, tax cuts or for whatever. But this idea that equity and creating, a kind
Hmm.
of inclusion for those at the bottom actually lifts all boats, if it
Hmm.
makes for a healthy economy that
Right.
includes that works for everybody.
Right. I mean, I was raised, my parents
Mhm,
were big supporters of Reagan and Reaganomics, et cetera. The
mhm, mhm,
idea that, right, all of that trickles down.
mhm,
And that doesn't seem to necessarily be the best analysis when we now look at how
mhm,
Reaganomics worked. But the opposite, right, where we're working from the bottom up, where we're growing something up, there actually seems to be some merit there, and I think Jubilee pushes us, in that
mhm.
direction, or at least opens up those conversations.
I loved it when you got to the kind of theme of hope.
Mm.
And I'm always interested in that subject, always in need of some more hope. We always could use some hope. But you had a really different, fresh way of talking about it. You said, hope is not a featherweight wish for something better. Rather, hope is more like striking a match, providing the spark of a fresh idea that addresses a conundrum too often rooted in one injustice or another. The
Mm.
strike and the spark are hope. They are the genesis of perennial labor toward justice. Or what was it that line from I thought was great of Walter Brueggemann? What did he say
Mm.
about kind of a conception of a testimony to the
A
otherwise?
testimony to the
Yeah,
otherwise.
the idea that another kind of world is possible, and
Yes.
that makes things possible if you just start with that imagination rather than
Mm.
thinking that things are hopeless or they can never be changed.
Right. And I think for Claude and I, what we have learned is that, for us, hope is deeply intertwined with the practice of lament,
Mhm,
right? The ability to clearly see what is wrong. And we think as practitioners, so to be able to really name what the problem is in our community that we want to address,
mhm,
and then to allow space to really lament, to feel
mhm,
the pain of that.
mhm,
Generally, it's others who are feeling the pain, the communities that we are partnering with, but we step into that and sit with them in that pain. And I think so many of us are scared of our pain. We're
mhm,
scared of the discomfort of
mhm,
that. But if you understand Isaiah, it seems to be in that space, the seed bed, that is in lament. That is where, for us, hope grows.
mhm,
That it is when we are in those spaces and allowed to feel the pain,
mhm,
somehow the Spirit generates fresh ideas. And some
mhm,
of the things that we do now came from those kind of moments where, the response to this, the idea to do a porridge factory, the idea
mhm,
to start a health clinic, the idea to, like, so many of the things came from that place of lament. And then this new
mhm,
idea sparks. And that, to me, that is hope, that you have a new idea. You know what the problem is, and you have felt its impact. And now there is a new idea, and we are going to get busy
mhm,
with hope and hard work, because most of these things are not solved in a day. They are solved in increments of, 5, 10, 20 years at a time,
mhm.
that we're leaning into these things. But, hope and hard work, I really can't separate them.
Well, I really love the way also that you showed and argued that these things can begin in very small ways, and we don't have to have a 10-year plan or something like that.
Hmm.
Just
Hmm.
kind of one step at a time,
Right.
and that you say each jubilary action, no matter how small, moves us toward the new city the prophet imagined, Isaiah.
Mm.
And I think that's encouraging too, that because you see that in your own book, in your own story, about how you
Mm.
started with one little thing and it became kind of contagious, or it grew, or it had wider implications. You
Right.
you 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 repair something, you plant trees, and that helps the soil, and that brings back families, and that brings back community, and you see the whole reality kind of changing,
Yeah.
just beginning with these efforts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of people ask, the question, how do we embody Jubilee here? And
Mhm,
I don't propose to tell, I'm not an economist. I
Hmm.
can tell you as somebody who understands the text, I can tell you something about biblical economies,
Hmm.
Iron Age, Israel and that economy and early first century
Hmm.
Palestine. And I
Hmm.
can, tell you a little bit about the Burundian economy, but my hope is I want you as a listener, as a
Hmm.
reader, as a, to take this and imagine, well, I know my local economy.
Hmm.
How do I contextualize this? How do I live this out in my own neighborhood? Um, and I trust that the spirit that worked in Claude and I to do what we're doing in Burundi is at work in all
Hmm.
of us as we
Hmm.
engage in our local communities. But I always tell people start with what's right in front of you.
Hmm.
Within our own families, within our own little neighborhoods, there are opportunities to think differently about money and about loans and forgiving loans. The Lord's Prayer leads us to,
Hmm.
pray that our own indebtedness would be relieved and that we would be the kind of people who would also break that cycle and relieve the indebtedness that people have to us.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
sometimes it's like, do people owe me something that I can free them from?
Hmm.
Right? Can we start with things that are that personal, that close, and then see what grows? I think that's part of what Jesus um, meant when he looked at his neighbors that day by the Sea of Galilee and said, "It can start today
Hmm.
because we can start."
Hmm.
Behaving in jubilary ways towards one another. We may not be able to affect the Roman Empire and its economy yet, but we can start behaving in jubilary ways
Hmm.
with and toward one another. And that is a really great place to start. And it whets your appetite. It whets your
Yeah. Yeah.
appetite for more. Yeah.
Could I ask you if you could share a little bit about what brought you to Burundi and this whole life? I mean,
Well, my husband is Burundian.
yes. Uh-huh.
So he was born and raised, less than $1 a day kind of poverty. Um, and so I met him well, in 1998 in
Hmm.
Santa Barbara. He came to speak at an Episcopal church that I was currently attending, and he spoke about the tribalism in his own country, and we were talking about reconciliation. And it was really that what began as a friendship and then of course grew into a 24-year marriage. But it was really that relationship with him that was catalytic. I had never heard of Burundi before.
Hmm.
When he told me he was from Burundi, I was like, oh gosh, is that a region? Is that a country? I was so embarrassed
Hmm.
that I had never heard the word before.
Hmm.
He said it. But that,
Hmm.
for me, it was a relationship because I never wanted to live in Africa or be a missionary or any of that. It was the relationship with him that opened the door to this place. And, for him, Burundi is the land not just of his birth, but of his highest hopes,
Hmm.
like what he most hopes for in the world, are,
Hmm.
are the good things that he wants to see happen among his people in Burundi to change the story that has just been so dismal there. And he has always said, it's a little country, but that means we can do some really
Yeah.
big things
Hmm.
in that
Yeah.
context. And
Yeah.
so, just because I love being with him and in partnership with him and working together with him, that really is how I got to be in Burundi.
Well, he comes across as quite an extraordinary person, a kind of visionary, a social entrepreneur, a deeply faithful person
He is.
who has used his education and his advantages that he's acquired to serve his country, serve the people.
Mm,
And it's absolutely a really inspiring story.
mm,
It resonated for me with other figures like E.F. Schumacher's kind of idea of economics as if people mattered. That was his
mm,
book Small is Beautiful, very very big book some years ago, which was very inspired by kind of Gandhian principles also, which I recognize
mm.
there. And Dorothy Day, whom I worked with,
Yes.
Catholic worker, she always talked about building a society where it's easier for people to be good, and she wanted not just to protest and how bad everything was, but to kind of mirror and embody, reflect what it would
Mm,
be like a society or a culture that was based on an alternative set of values, based on
yes.
community and sharing and generosity rather than
Hmm.
individualism and selfishness, greed,
Right.
acquisitive, spirit or something like that. So, I definitely felt that this was kind of a parable in a way that really had a message for readers in North America too. Um, Anything you'd like to say about that specifically, about how you think this might relate to our situation in this country? You referred a little bit to New York, but maybe other ideas occur to you.
I not, I mean, there isn't anything that comes to mind. Um, I still am just thinking of New York because I was so, I mean, it
Mhm.
takes a lot to get me excited about economics these days because so much of the
Mhm.
words out there are negative, and the numbers that we're getting, but that
Mhm.
gave me such hope. But uh, I I just find that Jubilee gives part of what I hope people will get from this parable, if you will, you know,
Mhm.
is is to crack open our
Mhm.
imaginations,
Yeah.
to recognize that yes, there are these ancient tools, and I think they give us some good things to talk about, some good ideas. I mean, loan forgiveness, we have medical
Mhm.
debt, and we do have some innovative organizations that are working to forgive medical debt, student debt, which you've
Mhm.
already mentioned. Of course, I lived through the housing crisis, and people losing homes. Like, I do think in some ways you don't need to imagine a whole lot because we have seen this happen in real time
Mhm.
here in our own context. So we have these tools to play with, but I think it also just cracks open space for us to, as the prophet does, imagine how could this look different? How could
Mhm.
we come at this different? And I really hope people will say, oh, well, that's interesting what they did there and what they're trying to do there, because we're still trying very much.
Mhm.
But what can we try here? Maybe it won't work, but we'll learn something. What can we try? What can we play with to try and make this a better economy for all of us?
Mhm.
It's not that I don't want those that have money. It's not that I have any angst against them other than, I wish they would accept the invitation to maybe not hoard all of it for themselves, but to recognize I can invest this, in the common good, and we will all be better for it.
Mhm. Mhm.
I do think Jubilee is good news to the poor and hard news for people who are doing okay. But hard news can also just mean you have been given an opportunity.
Mhm.
You've been given the chance to say, "Oh, I didn't recognize that about my neighbors or what was happening in my
Mhm.
neighborhood.
Mhm.
I actually can choose to divest
Mhm.
of some things.
Mhm.
I can actually choose to invest in some things. I can choose to function differently, and sacrificially for the sake of my neighborhood, And so it doesn't necessarily have to be hard in a pejorative sense, but it can
Mhm.
be a really wonderful invitation for those who want to know, how can I be more socially responsible?
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's more than just tithing to your church. Maybe it's also finding other ways that you recognize that you can be a really wonderful jubilary practitioner in your own neighborhood,
Mhm.
you know?
Well, thank you very much. You've given a real good taste, I think, of this wonderful book by Kelley Nikondeha, Jubilee Economics: The Purpose, Practices, and Possibilities for a Better Future. I urge everyone to read this. I thank you very much for joining me today, Kelley.
Thank you so much.